Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of the second section of Global Perspectives in Theater. This week, we are going to delve into some of the foundational theories that make the whole purpose of our course this quarter even exist. I know that I've already talked previously about how in the first quarter, we traveled all around the world. And this quarter, we're looking at how the world kind of became globalized so that you could look at, for example, an American or a Western theatrical tradition in the contemporary age and be able to examine the issues of global culture in general because the West became so heavily immigrant. And how that changes kind of the fabric of sociality and certainly cultural production, right? In the West, in the world, and there is no way that you can talk about multiculturalism without talking about the post-colonial. And we are examining a few different ways that is addressed. But there is no way that you can talk about post-colonial ideas without mentioning Edward Said. And that is what we are applying to the completion of our reading of Césaire's A Tempest. Now, we touched a little bit when we looked at Shakespeare last quarter on this concept of the other, right? That we see emerging as a kind of an established perception in colonial England, right? And Shakespeare is writing about this kind of mass colonialism that occurs from the West, in particular, when he was writing The Tempest, and we explored that a little bit. Now that you are completing your reading of Césaire's update to Shakespeare's work, we can begin to talk about the post-colonial theories that Césaire was engendering. And they are, in some ways, most popularly explained in Edward Said's seminal text, Orientalism. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Orientalism and then kind of contextualize it. I know I've asked you to read some pages from it, but it can be a fairly dense text. And even though you are absolutely capable of engaging with it, I think it's important to get many different facets of the way to understand it. First off, we have to understand that Orientalism is referring very specifically to Said's kind of notion of his post-colonial vantage. He is Middle Eastern, and he is thinking about the Orient as the way that Westerners referred to the Middle East, the Mid-East, and the Far East. So Asia. But while he is referring to that specifically, we can apply Said's ideas of Orientalism to all forms of colonizing, whether it be the overt colonizing or the hegemonic colonizing that we have referenced from last week's lecture. Okay? Said writes Orientalism in 1978. So post-colonial ideas are well on their way. I mean, we have been talking about, obviously, Césaire wrote A Tempest, which is definitely a post-colonial text. It's not like Edward Said is the godfather of post-colonialism, but what he does is he writes a book that really kind of encapsulates a lot of the ideas that were being tossed around, being discussed, being embodied in creative texts and media. And Said becomes kind of the central figure. Okay? He was a scholar in the humanities who grew up in Egypt and Palestine, but all of his education was Western. So he is very much kind of that double consciousness that we referenced on last week. And the purpose and value of Said's book, Orientalism, was to advance our understanding of the way that cultural domination of oppressed people has operated, and largely in a cultural context, not just in this kind of overt, take over a place and usurp its resources like the initial colonization operated as. But we also want to be thinking about it in terms of the way it shapes those who are colonized, and go into these concepts of the othering, to double consciousness, the subaltern, all these phrases that I mentioned in last week's lecture. It offers insight about colonialism from the perspective of one who has been colonized, which we do not get that perspective very often, because obviously the one in power is the colonial power. And so they're also going to be in control of a lot of what is disseminated culturally, meaning the texts that are generated, the Wikipedia of the time of sorts, the encyclopedia, the institutions that then govern what is valuable and good, right? So often the colonized don't have nearly the kind of influence in that perspective. And as it gets erased, so do the value systems. They are minimized. They are made either illegible or irrelevant, or at least to some degree, yeah? There are a series of questions that Said raised that kind of colors the idea of Orientalism. And I think that they are wonderful questions for us to be asking even today. One of them is, how do different academic disciplines come to service Orientalism, this idea of a presumed superiority of the West onto any other community, right? This imperialist idea. How do different academic disciplines come to service this? How do they come to challenge it, right? How does Orientalism transmit or reproduce itself from one epoch to another? So even as certain areas fight for their independence and achieve it, how does Orientalism, or this idea of a presumed Western superiority, transmit itself even afterwards? How about the basic questions of, how does authority operate? What ideas does it dignify as true? What perceptions and judgments does it reproduce and transmit? Who are the pioneers whose texts become authoritative and get cited frequently in academic literature? And we know that historically, and even today, that has largely been Western or Western trained. And that's going to be important as well, because the institutions, like the academic institutions that we see in former colonized places that might not be under Western control anymore, still have Western training, and it is perceived as being superior to what kind of academic training or what kind of intellectual, scholarly, or creative process existed prior to the colonized force. And that has more to do with power than it does with any kind of objective evaluation of virtue. So it's not so much that, let's say in India, it is understood that the British institutionalized academic tradition is superior to India. But it is perceived that way because of the power struggle and the legacy of India's oppression, or of England's oppression of India. Does that make sense? Another question is, how do the colonizers' depiction of the colonized society reflect the strong ideas, the doctrines, and the trends of the colonizers' own society? And how does that then transmit itself into even the ideations of those who are colonized, even those who are colonized who push against the colonizer. How have they been almost Stockholm syndromed in a way? How have those ideas permeated themselves into the value system so that even those who are colonized perceive the colonizer as being superior? And this is largely based on, again, power and dominance, a very physical dominance that then began to trickle into a cultural one. Okay? Examples of this could be Darwin's influence on other cultures, Freud's influence, right? Racist authors. And because they are taught as being truth to people that are in positions of oppression, they become embodied, so that the colonized even will take on the perspective of the colonizer's superiority. Another question I think is really interesting is, can one divide human reality into such clearly distinct categories as we, they, the West, the East, the colonizer, the colonized? And can we really survive the consequences of that distinction humanly without creating hostility? So really interesting questions that are being asked by the post-colonial scholar, the post-colonial thinker, the post-colonial citizen or agent. And so the ways to examine that is through literature, right? Said primarily did that. He looked at it through lit. But you can do it through film. You can do it through any cultural production to perceive how the colonizer or the dominant or hegemonic perspective has engendered itself into the culture of the colonized, and how that has perpetuated and persisted this idea of dominance or superiority. It's really fascinating to do post-colonial examinations of even the most innocuous texts. And so in my decolonial narratives class, we actually watched Disney's Pocahontas, and through a lens of post-colonial criticality, ripped that film apart. You would think, oh, Pocahontas is just, an innocuous love story. Until you begin to break down how, whether intentional or not, this idea of a hegemonic Western superiority has permeated even the most childish of stories, and how that can perpetuate this presumed idea that the West is superior. We all possess Orientalism, whether we are white, American, whether we are Asian from Taiwan, whether we are American with historical roots in the Middle East. We all possess Orientalism because it's a hegemonic colonization based on the way that we have been indoctrinated with the texts, whether intentionally or not, of Western superiority. And so it's a really fascinating exercise to see where we engender those ideas and how we learned them through the series of institutionalizations of our own existence, whether it be school, our home life, our newspapers, the great novels that we revere, the television shows we watch, all of it is institutionalizing Orientalism to some degree, and or is attempting to decolonize those powers, which we're seeing quite a bit of in more contemporary post-colonial media and art. And so this is what Said is referring to. It's important to understand his contrast conception. Okay? It is the source of one of Europe's deepest and most recurring images of the other that has helped to define Europe as its contrasting image, idea, personality, experience. Okay? And that is the dialectic of superiority, inferiority. It is presumed in a lot of this colonial mediated and textuality that those in the West see themselves not just as different, but as superior in comparison to all non-European peoples, whether they know it or not. That is what we refer to as hegemonic, right? And Antonio Gramsci coined that term, the dominant and accepted by consent as conventional wisdom or common sense. It's just kind of understood or common sense that the West is superior. And of course, that is subject to a tension, a force that goes beyond just basic evaluation. We need to think about it in terms of the perceptions of other cultures. To Said, the colonized people are something one judges, as in a court of law, something one studies and depicts, as in like a curriculum, something one disciplines, as in a school or prison, something one illustrates, like in a zoological manual. And that can, even if it is intended to celebrate the colonized, it is still reducing it to something that is beyond the four-dimensional quality of, let's say, the Western gaze, right? Gaze, where it's complicated, it's full of contradiction, right? Orientalism is, even in celebration of a culture, is essentializing it down to a two-dimensional kind of flatness. And therefore, it is understood to be inferior. And that is the danger that Said is mentioning in Orientalism, okay? Because it renders anyone who is not Western or is not in the presumed position of superiority as an object of study, right? They are stamped with the other. And that is a very passive, non-participating, non-active, non-autonomous, non-sovereign regard. And that becomes embodied even in many people who are part of the colonized. Okay? It is built on this idea that knowledge equals power, but it also equals domination. And so if the dominant power or the colonizer is the one dispensing knowledge to the colonized, well, it's further perpetuating their dominance over them, even if they don't physically control that community anymore. So I'm sorry that I feel like I'm doing some repeat in some way, but I think it's important to constantly think about this terminology and to consider what Said and post-colonial thinkers are thinking, right? It tends to be a very complex language that is built in order to disrupt the dominant power structures. It's very difficult to dismantle a dominant knowledge structure even. And so a lot of post-colonial theory feels convoluted or feels slippery because it's somehow trying to undermine itself as a dominant text. Don't worry about it. I'm just looping around here. But for the sake of what you need to know, I've asked you to read the intro and the first chapter of Orientalism and maybe think about this very basic lecture to kind of correspond to it so that it helps you begin to understand what Said was saying, what post-colonial thinkers are saying, and how you can apply that to a Tempest, which is the goal of your discussion question in the early part of the week is. Okay. I also have a little bit of lecture notes on the difference between race and ethnicity, which I think is really important, especially when you're reading a Tempest. And so I wanted to clarify those terms for the sake of what we're doing in the class. We first have to start out with the definition of race. And I'm using Edgar and Sedgwick from their book, Key Concepts in Cultural Theory, because I really enjoy that book. And I'm going to start with their definition. It's a mode of classification of human beings which distinguishes between them on the basis of physical properties, For example, like skin color or facial features, which purportedly derive from genetic inheritance. Okay? And if you recall from conversations that we have before, groups of people have almost always tried to separate or distinguish themselves from other groups of people, particularly those who are unlike them, either in temperament or custom or appearance. And we saw that even when we talked about the ancient Greeks, if you remember. What were the principles by which they distinguished themselves from their neighbors, which they would refer to as barbarians, right? Sometimes these principles were racial, inherited, right? But a lot of times they were just environmental or linguistic or theological. But then other times they involved kind of the physiognomy of individuals. And so this really happens in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the time of discovery, right? Kind of around the time that, a little before, but, in the same kind of epoch as Shakespeare writing The Tempest, right? Where we begin to see race emerge as a category. It becomes part of European thought, roughly around the 15th century. But it really peaked in the 19th and 20th centuries. And that largely has to do with Darwin. Its influence peaks in that time. And when we talk about the racialist view, what we must remember is this is in terms of descriptions of reality. Race did not simply imply a description of superficial physical characteristics. Rather, it implied a whole set of other naturally given inherited traits, moral and intellectual ones, like the definitions of honesty and genius and cheapness and sexual aggression. Yeah? So all of this was beginning to be kind of conflated together during this time, and it was a way to assert dominance. Now, the difficulty with this way of classifying people by supposedly natural or God-given physical traits that imply the existence or non-existence of other character traits is that the perception of differences are already culturally constructed. You find what you want to find. So, in fact, race is a construct. It doesn't exist in anything other than a cultural construct. Maybe you know this already, because your generation tends to be well versed on the fact that race is a cultural construct and not a biological one. Physical characteristics do not simply describe physical differences between people, but they do reveal a basic difference in identity and intrinsic value. Okay? That is where that rationale comes from. So racism draws a hierarchical distinction between races, opening a gulf between them and setting one racially designated group over and above another on a scale of moral worth, intelligence, or importance. And that is the danger, because you are fusing cultural constructs with physical attributes. You can imagine why post-colonial theorists and thinkers begin to see a parallel between racism and sexism, right? Because we think of the sexes as also having apparent physical characteristics. And then we begin to associate moral worth or intelligence or importance with that, when in fact, that is just a cultural construct. So once again, the post-colonial theorists believe that race is merely a cultural construct. Sex and gender can also begin to be woven into that as well. Okay? There is a widespread consensus among biologists and anthropologists that race is not real, that it has no content as a scientific category describing inherited physical and character traits. Okay? One, there's just simply too many people to fit into categories, right? And when you succeed in assigning someone to one of these categories, like on the basis of skin pigmentation and hair, say, that implies very little about their other biological characteristics. So it's really kind of impossible to create any kind of definitive consensus among what constitutes race anyway. Unfortunately, governmental institutions and other institutions of power still utilize it in some way and, in many cases, weaponize it. So, I mean, with all this, does that mean to say that race is not important? No. It means that it is not a biological given or a natural category, like gender. It is constructed. And it remains culturally important. Kwame Anthony Appiah puts it this way, and I like this. Races are like witches. However unreal witches are, belief in witches, like belief in races, has had, in many communities, continues to have, profound consequences for human social life. And hence, that is why we will talk about race as a social or cultural construction, rather than one of any kind of inherent, essential, or biological nature. Okay? Now, lastly, to clarify ethnicity. This is a little different. We hear this word a lot in relation to race. How might we define it? I'm going to use Edgar and Sedgwick again. Ethnicity refers to generally a word used to refer to different national groups, which identifies them in virtue of their shared practices, norms, systems of belief. It also denotes the self-awareness on the part of a particular group of its own cultural distinctiveness. So ethnicity is kind of bound more in the way a group identifies itself through a system of shared practices. This is definitely more interesting from an anthropological point of view, okay? Because there is something very real about it. However, it is a little slippery still. It can be unifying and it can be divisive depending on who is asserting it and in what context. It can also, the use of the term ethnicity can flirt with racism. Am I defining myself as ethnic, or is someone else doing it for me? And how is that process happening? So you can see there's some challenge there. The reason why I talk about this is all of it is necessary questions and ideas for beginning to understand the purpose of Césaire writing A Tempest. And in fact, we can even apply it to the next play we're going to be reading for Thursday, which is Gyogama's Foghorn, which is an indigenous satire. Have these kind of thoughts rolling around in your head. Do they need to be absolute and refined? No. Do I want you thinking about these ideas in tension of these post-colonial works? Yes. And that is exactly what Césaire and Gyogama are doing. Okay? Take it in. Then allow yourself to do the discussion question, which is synthesizing the latter part of Césaire's play with the concepts that you are gleaning from Said's Orientalism. Have a lot of fun with this. This is quite challenging. And this week seems to be a little bit of work because we're finishing one play, we're looking at Said's ideas, trying to grapple with them. We are reading another play as well, but you'll see how they kind of interrelate to one another. And if you need any help, consult my printed lecture notes, my PowerPoints. Let them help you out. I also have some supplementary videos to help you understand Said's Orientalist ideas and try to make sense of some of this. Yeah, we don't master it when we're introduced to it, but we certainly begin to ask questions that will lead us to mastering it. Have fun, you all, and I'll see you on Thursday. Take care.